Evening, everybody. Welcome to Spiritland. This is part of our 10th anniversary celebrations. We opened as a pop-up 10 years ago, and then we opened this site 8 years ago, and it was a very happy day when I saw Kevin and Lynn rolling down that road in a van with this sound system behind them, and this is a one-of-one creation. We're going to talk to Kevin about this system, about the other systems he builds, and his journey in music, and we're also going to listen to a lot of different music on the way. The first question is, when was the moment you realised there was such a thing as sort of this recorded music coming out of a speaker experience? What was your first memory of that?
Since childhood, I've really enjoyed that magic carpet ride and disappearing into whatever world that music was giving you. So it's hard to pinpoint a single moment. I dicked around with audio as a kid. I electrocuted myself many times with my mother's gramophone. And really, I think the thing that was interesting to me was music. But I had friends that were techno geeks. They loved dicking around with electronic circuits, mechanical engineering, designing turntables. And I spent time doing hi-fi exhibitions with them and enjoyed it hugely. And then a pal said that he'd seen this ridiculous pair of loudspeakers down at the General Motors roller skating rink at Luton. And it was a pair of something called a Vitavox Thunderbolt. A friend bought this pair of loudspeakers, and of course, there was nowhere to put them because they were absolutely enormous. So they decided they would leave them with me. And I fanned around with them and put a high-frequency system on them and played with a crossover and tried to make them more integrated and coherent. But what they did was they projected music with a vitality and an energy and a physical believability that you thought, wow, rock and roll, serious. And I ended up with this Frankenstein's monster of a system. And I'd play it to people and they'd go, fuck Christ, what? You've got to make it. And that speaker was the intellectual property of a company in Stanmore. And when I went to see the board of directors, the two sons of the founder from the 1930s were still there. And they were flattered and charmed at the idea that this spotty lad wanted to take one of their vintage designs up to speed and to market. And I could do as I wished with it. And I took it from there. And that's how the Living Voice Air Partner came into being. And that was 1991. And I played around with that and evolved it over many years. And that was the DNA of the Vox Olympian.
You make exquisitely high-end speakers. Your flagship speakers, the Vox Olympians, are in exquisite rare woods, gold finishes. They don't look like anything on earth.
And because of the bronze, it had an elegant steam Edwardian gentleman's machine look about it.
When your clients come to you, are they saying, I just want the best speakers that money can buy? What sort of briefs are they coming to you with?
So our client base is very, very wide in affluence. We love doing relatively budget systems for the centred music enthusiasts that don't cost the earth. It's about balance and proportion and getting something that puts musical values first. You can make a relatively budget and physically small system that is charming. So we make, I think, some quite democratically priced electronics, and we make some pretty bonkers stuff that I am literally embarrassed to talk about the price. What we should pacify ourselves with is that most of the people that buy the ludicrous stuff off somebody that hasn't got a clue. So they have the most expensive loudspeakers, the most expensive amplifier, the most expensive front end, but it isn't a system. It's porridge with filet mignon and tomato sauce. It is about the system being more than the sum of its parts.
I mean, one observation from me when I started listening to your equipment, you listen to it on your sound system and it's swinging along, and then suddenly, right, give the bass player a solo. Suddenly, a double bass comes alive. Mm. If you can talk us through the components in these speakers and how you get that kind of sound.
Well, the love lives in the mid-range. If you listen to an unamplified acoustic set, it could be a string quartet, it could be a piano trio, no PA, no mics, in an appropriate sized venue. The thing that really strikes me is the dynamic range. There's no sense of constraint, there's no containment, there's no compression, and there's a freedom of movement. And it gives it an expressive, limpid lucidity in its musical eloquence that is goosebump-inducingly marvellous. And a conventional loudspeaker tends to compress the dynamic range. It sounds so far removed in pungency from what was actually performed. A conventional loudspeaker, a two-way or three-way loudspeaker with drive units on the front of the cabinet with an air volume behind it, it is very, very inefficient at what it's trying to do. With a horn-loaded loudspeaker, it's quite the opposite. It's very, very sensitive, and you don't need a huge amount of amplifier power. With the amplifier power you've got, you can resolve this lovely, effortless contrast that can charm and shock in equal measure. You want it to be able to convey a broad range of sentimental expression with a fidelity to sentimental content. So it should be able to be as soulful as it is physically impressive. What you're trying to do is reproduce the preserved art of the recording, so you don't want the loudspeaker to colour or affect the sound in any way. But what you know is that if you use a horn-loaded device and you have a drive unit in a restricted airspace, that column of air in the trumpet is 100% energised, and it's an acoustic transformer. It's, for the sake of argument, it's an acoustic amplifier. Excellent news. The downside with a horn is it can only operate over a relatively limited bandwidth. So whereas you could get a two-way loudspeaker that can cover the full musical bandwidth, here we've got two 18-inch drive units working up to 70. That's not horn-loaded. A horn-loaded sub would be too big for this room, but we cross over to the satellite speaker, and you've got a 13, 15-inch drive unit working from 70 hertz, which is not that low, up to male voice maybe 500 hertz. And then that aluminium horn in the US military now here, this styly, that is doing 500 hertz to about 5K. So it rolls off acoustically. So you then move to a shorter trumpet, that thing up there, which is a JBL slot dispersive. And then there's a super tweeter that goes up to 35 kilohertz. And then on top of it, just for good measure, there's another JBL firing backwards to equalize the power response in the room and give more presence and openness. In a venue like this, where there's a lot of people, some people are a long way away, some people are quite close, you need that projection.
Is everyone clear on that? Okay, because there'll be questions during the break. There's really beautifully produced tracks out there which show off your systems. If we were to come to the Living Voice room, what would you be playing? What kind of stuff?
There's a Melodia recording of the Shostakovich Babi Yar, which is, it absolutely consumes you, and you've almost got this post-coital incapability at the end of it and need to light two fags and lie down. That's his trademark move, by the way. We talked about the cabinetry, the crossovers, the drivers, the internal geometry. What's the secret sauce in a speaker design? You're going to say all of that. Yeah, I think it is all of it. It's just like a fantastic gastronomic experience is about proportion, balance, choices, and getting the whole thing to work together. If you listen to a system and swap out the speaker cables, they all sound different. If you move the system onto a different equipment table, you get a different balance. If everything, you can hear everything.
Just to show what this system can do and what it's about, tonight we're just going to play a whole range of music that Kevin's picked that show off what these speakers do. Vega Trails, it's a track called Tremors in the Static. This is on the Gondwana record label, which is our friend Matthew Halsall, who's played here quite a few times, incredible musician, and really beautifully produced.
Beautifully produced, and this
albums.
Is beautifully produced. This is a duet, so bass, and he plays a variety of woodwind instruments. So this track is an earworm and is quite short, and it's rather charming.
That sounds absolutely gorgeous. And I'll talk a bit about how we started working together. I was a hi-fi nerd and buying bits, and maybe it's the CD player. No, I need to upgrade my leads, da-da-da-da-da. And then I went to the Munich High-End Festival, which is this kind of audio gathering that happens every year, and there's just room after room of amazing equipment, some of it completely wildly esoteric and, one power lead mounted on the wall and whatever. And I went to your room where Kevin and Lynn were demonstrating their system and heard Blues in Orbit. And it's a big band album. It's like a time machine hearing music in that quality. And it was such an intense experience. I just thought, well, I'm completely on the wrong track. I've got to ditch all my stuff and start from scratch. So we started working together, and then I was saying, I want to open this bar in London, and here we are.
You suggested you had this idea for rescuing music from technology and rescuing music from hotel lobbies, and that it kind of abuses music, and you wanted to make music the centre of what you were doing here, based on your experience in the Japanese kissa bars, where you got a reverential audience turning up at a place with usually some 1950s American audio system, big turntables, 12-inch tone arms, Autophon SPU cartridges, big speaker systems, and people sit down, they don't talk, and they listen to a whole album maybe. It's quite an inspiring thing that you've got a culture that is reverential of music and wants an immersive experience to the exclusion of everything else.
And it's such a luxury to listen to music with that attention span, the way you'd watch a film, the way you'd read a book. It doesn't come easily in our current era where we're all totally distracted.
Let's just play 3 or 4 minutes of LP2 Side A Track 2.
While we're lining that up, do you want to just say what we're playing this on tonight, as in that turntable setup? Because that's quite nuts in itself.
This record player is made by a company called Kuzma. It's the complete opposite of a marketing-led startup type business. Deep foundations in mechanical engineering and very, very thoroughly thought out and no bullshitty. And this is the second from the top of his hierarchy. So this thing's 80 kilos. It's machined from brass. It's got a ruby bearing thrusting onto a Tefnol thrust pad, a 22 kilo platter, and a very high torque DC drive run by a regulated electronics power supply. And that's a super duper thing. One of his tone arms on there, which I chose for here because I think it might be impossible to break. You could probably change your tyres with it. Then in the head shell, if you're a nerd, an Autophon SPU Classic NE. Very old-fashioned, originally designed in 1957. And I think Autophon probably would have stopped making it by now if it hadn't got such a cult following in Japan.
And while we're talking about turntables, why would you need a 22 kilo platter when a turntable just needs to rotate at a consistent speed?
So the stylus is sitting in the groove, which is V-shaped. So the diamond is sitting in there, and there is a frictional interface. And if you've got very large modulations, the cannons going off in the 1812, so huge dynamic range, and quite large stylus exertions, there is a varying frictional resistance. And you might think that it is insignificant, but you're talking about microns here that you're reading in the groove. So if you have a 22 kilo platter, the rotational inertia is vast, and it can overcome any braking effect of the record on the stylus.
Right, we're going to play something quite recent, 2016. It's the Luke Vibert.
Quite nice that you can play bang banging club tunes as well as Petrus Vas.
Yeah. If there was a club that sounded like that, you wouldn't get me out of it. That sounded gorgeous. So that was Felix Laband, the track's Righteous Red Berets. Just before we end, we're just going to take a few questions. If anyone has, it could be speaker, it could be hi-fi, it could be musical, acoustics. Anyone in the audience got anything to ask? Yes.
I just wanted to ask about the inclusion of a super tweeter. So they go up to 35k, but isn't that well beyond the range of human hearing?
So we get back to this business with men in white coats saying you can't hear a pure sine wave at 35k, so there's no point in it being there. And then equally well, you could argue that on a compact disc or on a digital recording, there's no information in there above 20k. So why on earth do you want to have a thing that goes up to 35 or 45k? Well, I think the advantage that I have is I don't really care. People make them, and you think, well, does it taste good? Does it feel good? What does it do? So let it make the argument for itself. And a few people were saying, years ago, this matters. So, for example, on the Vox Olympian, there's this HF unit, and the diaphragm, you could measure its thickness in molecules. It weighs an angel's hair, so you can modulate it up at these high frequencies. And you introduce that into the system. The weirdest thing is the filigree and texture in upper bass playing, and the depth and naturalness of tonal colours. So you think, well, this is bizarre. I can't actually hear it, but I can hear it. What's that about? And I think we can invent explanations for it, but I like empirical iterative development, and if it works, it works. I'm delightfully free of needing a scientific argument. It's very hard to find a scientific argument. I mean, I doubt I'd hear a sine wave above 15k these days, but I can hear that super tweeter working, so I can't and can answer your question in that way.
Yes, sir.
On this sound system, what kind of music will you advise not to play, and why?
It would make a bag of spanners sound nice. So, no, I think that's the thing about a good system, is that it should be able to play a completely broad and Catholic library of music. Obviously, what we would ideally like is beautiful production values, beautiful performance, beautiful recording. That's what we want, but we can't always have it. And you listen to some recordings that it takes a while for you to develop an ear for them. The old late 50s to late 60s Deckers that have this sort of slightly woody, slightly heavy-boned, slightly bullying quality. But when you get used to that, they sound fabulously authentic. And they sound like people, once upon a time, creating music. You then listen to a modern ECM recording, which is pristine. Some people don't like them. They think there's something slightly astringent and sterile about them. I disagree. I think a lot of those recordings are absolutely wonderful.
I'm just going to jump in and answer that question from our view. When we've been going eight years here, and we've had every kind of music, every genre, it's such a revelatory system. Most of the information is happening in these kind of magical frequencies which you've picked out with this system, and suddenly it's this just a really arresting musical moment. Right, listen, we could go on forever. Deep thanks to Kevin and Lynn, the power behind the throne, who've been our partners. They're like the fifth Beatle in the Spiritland project. So for giving your time and your talent and coming and tickling our system. But thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been a real treat to just hear this music in complete silence and with some focus. So thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. Yeah.